Psychosocial Wednesdays. This is an initiative by me, Paula Tonello, Stefano Carpani, and Bernhard von Goretzky. More than a century ago, Freud gathered colleagues for Wednesday meetings that opened the world of psychoanalysis to a wide range of powerful ideas. Psychosocial Wednesdays are modeled on those Wednesdays and on Jung's meetings at the Psychological Club, and feature speakers from different psychoanalytic traditions, schools, and associated fields. Tonight we have as a guest Polly Young-Eisendrath, which I'm very pleased about. I first saw Polly some years ago when she spoke in Edinburgh. It was at a point when I had been visiting the Jung Institute in Zurich, enjoying studying but not really working at it. When she spoke, I thought, if this is the kind of work Jungian analysts do, I want in on it. So very grateful to see her here. She's going to speak about the meaning of contagion, masks, toxins, and the fear of infection. So welcome, Polly, and I'll let you start.
Thank you, Paul. Hello, everyone. And since I haven't seen Andrew in many years, I want to do a particular hello to Andrew, who happens to be showing up on my screen. So I want to talk about this topic because of my own distress and the ways in which I have noticed shifts in my clinical practice as well as in my community around the issue of mask wearing and around the what I would say the fear and fantasy of contagion, and how those issues have become more problematic as the contagion factor has lowered. So I live in Central Vermont in the US, and we have flattened our curve, which was never much of a curve anyway. For the last 3.5 weeks, the curve has been flat. Many days we have no new cases. We've had in our state, which has only 620,000 people, we've had 55 deaths, and most of those have been in nursing homes. And as the curve has flattened, mask wearing has become mandatory in a number of establishments in order to enter. And in some of the towns, including our biggest city, Burlington, children who are 3 years old and up have to wear masks, as well as all adults, except I've heard that African American men are not mandated to wear masks. And so the masks have become a part of our community as the contagion factor has lowered. And I realize, I'm not in a densely populated area here, but I also was interested in speaking about this topic because I was interviewed on a program called Growing Good Humans, a podcast, and the host there, Lisa Pressman, asked me to talk about how children might perceive the wearing of masks and the seeing of masks on adults. And in doing the research for that program, of course, I went back to the initial infant studies that show that the blank face of an adult for a young infant is terrifying. And so the way that children look at grown-ups wearing masks is really very different than the ways that we look at each other, perhaps. So there are several things I want to sketch out in the beginning, and then I'd like to take some questions and kind of move back and forth between my thoughts and your questions. So, I'm just going to say this as a review, but I always think it's worth saying that a great deal of our communication takes place unconsciously. We know also that we are fundamentally unconscious as beings. Of course, Jung thought that without all of the measurements, but now the neuroscientists say 95% to 99% unconscious. What that means is that we simply do things in an automatic way. Like, for example, you get into your car and then you arrive at home and you can't really remember driving home at all. So we have very bad working memories, and our memories, which there are 5 different kinds of memories in humans in different parts of the brain. The memory systems we have conflict as well. So a lot of our communication takes place through gestures, signals, tone of voice implication, actually very little through language, and very little is remembered from what people say. It's much more the way they look and also the tone of voice. Now, these things are probably obvious. If you're a therapist or an analyst, you know this material already, but I like to remember it because it enters into the issues that we're going to be talking about today. The way that I understand projective identification, and we could say also Jung's idea of the participation mystique, is that there's a sort of an emotional kidnapping of one person by another. Sometimes it's very subtle. It happens all the time in ordinary communication, and the other person plays out whatever that kidnapping is about, maybe without not even knowing it. So I'll give a quick example in case sometimes I think psychoanalysts have made this topic too complicated and too abstract, and so don't really understand how ordinary the communication is. So I do a couples therapy that's called dialogue therapy. In the first meeting, when the couple comes in, I ask the two people to talk to each other about their reasons for being there. I let them know that I'm going to get all the background information, that they can talk in any way they want to with each other about why they're there. I'd say about 80% of the time, one person says, "Why don't you begin?" Now that person has begun. The other person generally takes that order and begins. And sometimes the tone of "why don't you begin" is more or less like, "I'm tired of talking to you, so why don't you begin?" Sometimes it's more like, "I'm sort of shy, so why don't you begin?" And sometimes it's more like an invitation, like, "Why don't you begin?" But in any case, it's confusing because the person who's speaking has begun and has essentially given an order to the other person, who then typically obeys and carries out that order and begins, even if they're a little flustered. So the projective identification there is that one person has implied, "I'm taking control and you should listen and do it," and the other person does it. And then there may be still more blowback between the two people because of that moment. Sometimes there is and sometimes there isn't. So in ordinary life, there are many times when we direct others to carry aspects of ourselves, or we want them to carry out something that we, imagine they're thinking or feeling. And then once they do it, we confirm that they've done it. And if this is an ongoing relationship, like a couple relationship or adult, a child and a parent, siblings, friends, adults particularly, there can be a repetitive quality to chronic projective identification, where one individual is projecting something, the other one is playing it out, and then is also going in the other direction. So there's evoking, projecting, identifying, and that's taking place often outside of words, outside of awareness even often. And this makes communication very complicated for human beings. And there's one other little piece I want to just mention in regard to this. As Yuval Harari points out multiple times in Sapiens, we as human beings operate a lot on what he calls fiction. That is, we talk about what is not present, what is not in the room, what we're not doing. And other animals, while they have complex language, cannot do that. So I can say, "I saw Joe this morning and he was with your wife," but the higher apes can only say something like, "Pass the banana." They can't talk about Joe and his wife. So that gives us lots and lots of levels of meaning in which we are exchanging implied ideas or emotional meanings outside of what we're actually talking about going on in any moment. So and then the other thing that I wanted to mention is the collective unconscious. So over the years, I have had different sorts of understandings of Jung's collective unconscious, and I've kind of settled on the idea that is a part of Yogacara Buddhism. That's Indian Buddhism from the 3rd to the 5th century. And it's a name that's called home consciousness, the Alaya Vijnana, seed consciousness. And it's a form of consciousness that is a stream of consciousness running sort of underneath our awareness, you might say, or outside of our awareness. And while we are unconscious of it, it is conscious. So we're unconscious of it, but there are motivations and intentions from this unconscious stream, this mind stream. And it's collective, it carries meanings of culture and language. From a Buddhist perspective, that's the consciousness that travels lifetime to lifetime. You enter into a mind stream, then you leave that mind stream, etc. So from the point of view of the collective unconscious, various kinds of topics, or let's say meanings or emotional meanings, come and go. So you might have, for example, certain kind of psychopathology that becomes popular. Around here, there was a lot of chronic fatigue syndrome when I first moved to Vermont. Now it's almost completely disappeared. Of course, multiple personality disorder when I was in Philadelphia. And maybe one of the current sort of popular themes is my partner is a narcissist. That shows up a lot in a lot of conversation. So we get into this thing that's called this pandemic, and it's the result of a virus that we don't know much about. And we still don't know much about it, even though we know more than we did 2.5 months ago. So we don't know if the virus is happening naturally or if it's created by human beings. And there's a lot of panic instilled in our media and also in our communications with each other as soon as we come to hear about the idea that this virus is highly contagious. When we first heard about this, I wrote a Psychology Today blog called Taking a Pause. And in it, I mentioned that I was uncertain myself about why we were asked to stay at home, and everything was closing, the schools were closing. And the way I wrote that, Psychology Today wrote back to me and said they wanted to edit it out because it made it confusing as to what people should do. I wasn't questioning what people should do. I was simply raising my own question about not knowing why we were being directed as we were being directed. So immediately I knew there was something in the collective unconscious that I was activating by even sort of making the comment that I am in Vermont, sitting in Central Vermont. I, at that point, wasn't afraid of the virus. And I'd also just come back from Barcelona, where I'd seen a lot of Chinese people, and I had gotten sick. But at that point, the symptoms I had didn't meet the symptoms that were being listed by the World Health Organization. Anyway, I realized even when I wrote that first blog that there was something about the idea that we were supposed to be afraid and we were supposed to shut down that was coming into the collective mind. So I started thinking about contagion at that point, and I realized, and with kind of a startle reaction one morning, early in the morning, that number one, a lot of our rights were being taken away, particularly the right to assemble, and also that they were being taken away because of the idea of contagion. And then I recognized that in almost all of the sort of terrible projects of humanity, from Holocaust to witch hunts, the others were always contaminated. They were always contagious, and they had toxins that we had to protect ourselves against. So either we had to round them up and put them somewhere, or we had to cover them up in some way. And then I began to think of burqas and other kinds of body coverings for women, because women communicate something by their very being, and they're walking down the street, and that's contagious to men. And so you have to cover up so that the men don't pick up on signals that are unwanted. So I just started sort of riffing in my own mind on contagion, and then that led me eventually to recognize that we were set up in this whole sort of framework. And I don't think this was an intentional setup. I truly don't. I think it was unintentional, and yet it got picked up and used. We were set up to moralize about this illness and to moralize about who is the bad one and who is the good one. And where I live, because there's really no one that, I mean, I know some people through some people who have had SARS, but no one I know personally, unless I did, I don't know. But I didn't know people to avoid, but I began to see that there were going to be other ways of sorting people out. We started out with social distancing. A number of times I walked into shops where somebody told me to back up, and I was more than 6 feet away from them. And then, through just watching how that was happening and recognizing there's an archetype that is associated with being contaminated, I was wondering what was going to happen next. And that's when the mask wearing kind of came into at first it was a suggestion here in Vermont, and then it began to be mandated, particularly at the co-op where I shop. And as the mask wearing came in, there were more strict regulations, so that going into shop, every person had to stand in a separate parking space, and there was someone with a bullhorn shouting at us about the regulations within the co-op, and we all had to wear masks. And then just recently, less than a week ago, when I was walking into the co-op wearing my mask, and I was talking with a friend who was 6 feet apart, the woman with the bullhorn shouted out, "No talking, talking spreads the virus." Now this is after the curve is flattened and we're both wearing masks. And so I knew at that point that things had gotten to this point of a kind of a fascist-like feeling about the mask wearing, about the communication, and in particularly the spaces where I might have previously been pretty relaxed, which would be shopping at my co-op. So that sort of led me to think about a little bit more about what we communicate in the mask. Certainly in the unconscious meaning of mask is to create a disguise, to cover up. Usually here in North America, no one would wear a mask except at Halloween or Carnival, those kinds of events. And in looking up the research that has been done, and there have been double-blind studies, I didn't know that, but in dental health, you can look them up yourself, on wearing the N95 mask, which is the most protective mask. They found that a dentist who had an infection would not fully protect his patient from the infection, his or her patient, by wearing the N95 mask. So, and the only protection would be to wear the full plastic shield over the face. And remembering that, of course, no one has ever said that these masks protect ourselves. They only protect supposedly others if we're infected. So that was interesting, just to find out that even the most developed and the most official mask does not protect from the function that we're told we're protecting others from our own infection. And then I looked at the World Health Organization, found that they're very dubious about people wearing masks because we don't know how to deal with contamination, if there is contamination, with a mask. And then on top of that, there has never been a time when well people have worn masks except to cover up other kinds of things, like to wear if you're a woman, to cover yourself sexually, or to wear a mask in a party or a time when you want to be disguised. That would be the reason why well people would wear masks. So the idea that well people now are wearing masks in order to protect other people from infection, even when there's no real indication that there's anything contagious around, I think is something to pay close attention to. And I'm just going to say one more thing about the archetype of contagion and the way it plays out in terms of communications. So you probably know that disgust is one of the primary emotions that human beings are born with. So human beings are born with, you can sort them as 5 or 7 or 9 primary emotions. And I like the 5 because they're easy to remember. So the 2 positive ones that are expansive are joy and curiosity. And then there is sadness and disgust and fear. So those are primary motivators in the human infant for communication. So we express and we evoke emotions. It's a primary communicative system that we're born with. And of course, it's before language enters in, before culture enters in, before we're discriminating ourselves in that range of the collective unconscious, where we haven't yet developed our own consciousness of that. And we're carried along in that early period of time by those primary emotions until we get to the secondary emotions or the social emotions, which develop when we're 18 months to 2 years old. Those secondary emotions promote our communications about self and other in groups. Those are emotions like shame and guilt and envy and self-consciousness, embarrassment, self-pity, pride. But disgust is the major motivator for morality. And it actually is the revulsion that the human infant feels when in contact with something that's toxic or dangerously toxic. So that pulling back and revulsion eventually organizes into our sense of morality, of things that we can trust and move towards, or things that motivate us to back off in disgust or in revulsion. So contagion obviously is highly motivating for feelings of disgust and also self-protection. The mask wearing, I found, has kind of sorted itself into a certain kind of language, at least in my community. And as I have figured out the language, it seems to be that wearing a mask means that you are virtuous and compliant. And not wearing a mask means that you are not virtuous and not compliant. Now, in different communities, I think there may be different variations on the mask and not the mask. But I think the wearing of the mask has become its own language. And the language has something to do with moralizing and creating splits and projective identification, and essentially communicating either by tone of voice or by signal around whether you think the person is doing something wrong or doing something right. So that's one level of communication that's going on around mask wearing. Then there's the other issue of not being able to see people's faces. And, when you're covered up, except for your eyes, it's very difficult to actually know what the person is feeling, because we look at the whole face, and especially the expression that leads from right around here up through the eyes to know what the person is feeling. So for children and for people who have any kind of apprehension about other people's motivations, which I'm beginning to get now, since the mask wearing has become part of my community. There's a kind of anxiety about not knowing whether the person is smiling at you, whether the person is angry. I found I've become kind of anxious in greeting people. I want to say hello, how are you doing? Because I want to tap into that sense of what's going on in your world because of the mask. So there are multiple levels of the masks affecting us. There's the level of affecting children and children not knowing how to read the face of an adult that has a mask on. There's the level of what the mask signals in terms of moral standing. And then there is the general sense of masks actually being disguises for things that we want to hide. Then on top of that, and I think this is probably where I want to stop, there's the archetype of contagion itself, and the way that it has been associated with essentially putting some people away from others and keeping them away because of their toxicity, and then feeling as though that's a good decision because it keeps others from being contaminated. So I'd like to stop now and just have a conversation about this. I've kind of downloaded everything that was on my mind about it.
Thank you for that. Was very steady, very powerful, a lot of really interesting material. I work a great deal on HIV, AIDS,
yes,
and that whole way of thinking, which is different and the same as this. So
yes. It's exactly, I would say it's exactly in the ballpark.
Well, my own impression, and this is only an impression, is even though the disease is completely different, the panic is the same. It seems identical, which is
Well, it's contagion. It's the issue, I think, of contagion plus disgust.
Of course.
You know.
A number of people have asked a factual question, first of all, because I don't think people are aware of what is happening in Vermont. I think Dennis Merritt was the first one to ask it, which is, why are African American men not expected to wear masks? That seems
well, I have to say that what I said about that is hearsay in the sense that I haven't actually read that rule, but the person who said it to me is very trustworthy, so I'm going to assume that he has read it accurately. Mm-hmm. And here's my understanding. There was an objection on the part, so African Americans are a rather small minority in Vermont. There was an objection on the part of African American men to wearing masks, because in the past, if an African American man was wearing a mask, people would think he was robbing a store.
Right.
Because it signaled that he was trying to disguise his identity in order to commit a crime. Mm-hmm. So that communication from the African American side was made mask wearing pretty unwelcome. Mm-hmm. And so I think that this stipulation allowing African American men not to wear a mask if they didn't want to, they weren't mandated. In other words, I think it's connected to that.
Yes. Leslie Gardner has pointed out the odd thing of Trump not wearing a mask, which leads us, of course, into Trump and the world. And yes, I don't know if you want to go there, but that has been a strange part of all of the images and photographs of the last weeks. Trump is the one with no mask.
So, I think the more interesting thing is, why are we reading everything in terms of masks? Mm-hmm. When did that sort of start happening, that we're reading people by whether they're wearing a mask or not, and we don't really know the situation they're in or the level of actual contagion around them. We're just reading a mask. And to me, that's much more, I think I said at the beginning, and it might have been when Stefan interviewed me, or somebody interviewed me anyway, when I said that I was more concerned about people's responses, people responding to the virus, than the virus itself, because I did look into quite a bit of research on the virus right at the beginning and tried to inform myself. And I actually had H1N1, which is not the same. It's not a SARS virus, but it's in that same respiratory type of viruses.
Yeah.
And I did get pneumonia from it. And I realized that the virus, I thought for everything I could read that the virus was going to have difficult impact, but that it wasn't going to be at the level of the modeled statistics for death.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought, yeah, this is going to be a tough run and we're going to have to be careful, but I'm more concerned about what's happening with this virus, with the panic and the sense right away that, we have to shut things down and we have to wear masks, because I knew that right away there was a creation of an us and them about the virus that was very strong. And plus the fact that I had just been in Barcelona on Chinese New Year's, and I'd been in a customs line with maybe, it was, I don't know, hundreds of Chinese people, maybe 1,000 Chinese people in a long customs line that was 3 hours long. Some people were wearing masks, some weren't. I knew about the virus at that point. I think it was January 28th. But I was thinking, okay, I didn't wear a mask. I sort of thought, well, I get the virus, I'm here on Chinese New Year's. I don't know, somehow I was measuring something called risk against something called benefit, and I wanted to have a good time. And it seems that now risk has gotten really heightened, and the benefits of us, say, assembling or communicating openly with each other, those benefits haven't really entered into the conversation. And I'm just going to bring one other piece in here because I forgot to say it. So in the course of the pandemic here in Vermont, and I know about a number of suicides, and I also know about a couple of deaths in nursing homes and care facilities. And something that I feel very strongly about is the fact that family members were not even given the choice of putting on a hazmat suit in order to be able to visit somebody who's in a nursing facility to oversee their care or to visit them when they're dying during this pandemic. Consequently, people have died because they've gotten pneumonia, and the staff, not the SARS-related pneumonia, but just a pneumonia, because the staff was overwhelmed and anxious and weren't checking on individuals, and no family members were overseeing their care. And so nobody was given a choice even to decide whether there's a benefit in being close to a loved one in a so-called care facility, even if it's not a nursing home, but residential care, to be able to wear protective gear and go in. So we decided, no, those people are going to be considered off limits. So that's the kind of risk-benefit analysis that seemed to go out the window, as soon as we came in with the idea of contagion. And then we began to read masks, and that started, a whole other conversation. So I went a bit off on a sidebar there, but I wanted to bring in.
I do, by the way, I do also sense there's a difference between the risk and benefit measurements of the medical personnel who do not trust normal people to listen, which is probably fairly smart, and the way normal people then interpret that and or regard it as either perfect or failing, right? It's so difficult there.
Well, that's in the nature of contagion also. I mean, as soon as you introduce the idea of contagion, people become afraid. and they're going to react through more disgust. They're going to be motivated to, protect themselves and also to move away from anyone who is thought to be in the contagious group, whether or not that person is in the contagious group. And, it is true that the World Health Organization did not take a position on mandatory mask wearing. And it's also true that there's never been a double-blind study or any study of well people wearing masks. But there were a lot of medical people who commented in newspapers about, well, that might be okay to wear a mask. And what I've often heard is, well, okay, maybe it really doesn't protect anybody, but does it hurt anybody to wear a mask?
Mm-hmm.
And I would say yes.
Okay.
I think it can. I think it sets up a kind of false communication, and that I think we're pretty motivated as humans to moralize and to deal with the issues of purity and impurity.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we love to jump on something that goes in that direction because we assume we protect ourselves that way.
Yes.
And again, I think these are archetypes. I don't think these are individual issues. I mean, some individuals take it further than others, but because, if you tend to be sort of a paranoid person, or you in sort of a paranoid schizoid state, you might take it a little further. But I do think all of us have to be careful not to use that sense of us and them, because it's right there always.
Yes.
And so yes, I think that wearing masks needs to have a much more complicated conversation than what we're having, recognizing that scientifically it doesn't carry any water at all. Now, if you're working in a place where there is contagion, you should probably wear complete protection,
Mm-hmm.
not a mask. That's what comes out of the research on masks.
There are a couple of rather dense comment questions, if I may. Let me
Sure.
hear the first one. This is, pardon me, they're moving rather fast now. Arg. Technology. Dominique Marguerite asked and said, masks are also communicating that for this period of time, the awareness of my being socially linked to you and my link to you could be masks are also communicating that for this period of time, the awareness of my being socially linked to you. Right, okay. And my link to you could be harmful, and I will wear a mask to minimize that? Is that anything to say?
I think she's correct. I think she's correct, because again, the idea is so again, we have to kind of think of I'd like to think about this wearing disguises for women, particularly because I had a long conversation once when I was in Thailand. Well, I was participating in a conversation with Buddhist monks about why women can't even brush past their robes or come into certain monasteries. The idea was not that the monks had something in their own eyes that made it difficult to look at a woman. Mm-hmm. The idea was that the woman brought in with her this kind of disturbance to the monks, that she brought in with her this seductiveness, or she brought in with her this sort of atmosphere of something that stirs up the monks. So covering up the woman, keeping her away, is the way we'll handle this. It's not in their eyes, it's in her body. It's that same idea. Yes. You cover it up because it's in you, that you're protecting others from what is troubling or bad. They can't take it on. So I think she's on it. Yes.
Yes. Andrew Samuels, here's a substantial one again. This is good, but it's huge, I'll warn you. Could you run the mask theme through the filters of gender, race, and socioeconomics? Would you agree that there is variation that may not fit easily with archetype, unless archetype means basically what grabs or possesses one's attention over time? So, gender, race, money, wealth.
Well, I like the question. Thanks, Andrew. And yes, the way I look at archetype is that it's a constraint on our perception, imagination, ability to think. And I think the constraints have to do with our embodiment, our emotions, our instincts, the way we're hardwired, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yes, I consider archetype to be in that way. And yes, I think the variations by gender, race, age, oh, lots of things, whether or not you're Trump, the variations are limitless, actually, probably, on what specifically the mask might be communicating.
Mm-hmm.
And I think especially because I have thought a lot about the burqa and talked to women who liked wearing the burqa, as well as women who felt denigrated by wearing the burqa. It's powerful, powerful communicator. And it almost always means covering up what is too difficult for you to handle. And, or, if the woman likes wearing it, it's like, I'm covering it up so you don't even have to interact with me because I don't even want to interact. But if she's made to cover it up, then she feels like I have to cover this up because it's too hard for others to deal with it. So yes, there are lots of variations. For the Black man, it might be, I'm robbing the convenience store. For the woman, it might mean something else. For the child, it might mean it's sort of frightening to see faces without knowing what the motivations are from those faces, because most of the face is hidden.
Sure.
But I think it's a strong communication for everybody. And whether it has conscious meaning, like virtuous or not virtuous or whatever, I think there's an unconscious meaning that's going on at the same time. And I think that unconscious meaning is further stirring our anxieties about our situation.
Mm-hmm.
And I find that people are more anxious now that we know something about the virus and that the curve is flattened here. And I have a couple people that don't want to come to therapy because they have adapted to staying at home. And then I saw a couple where the couple came in wearing masks. They had asked me to wear a mask. And I said, look, I'll wear the mask, but you guys live together. I'm not afraid of you, and I need to read your faces. So I'm not going to allow you to wear a mask. And they were thrown by that.
Okay.
I mean, it doesn't make any sense, folks. It's like they live together. I needed to read their faces. The protection would have been from whatever I might have to them, but they were feeling comfortable wearing masks.
There are some more dense questions. This is Leslie Gardner. This is a horizontal move, but I think an inevitable one. It's been scary to watch the riots because many people are wearing masks, Black men included, as they set fire or loot. It's a strange combination of action. I don't know if it's
possible to take that. I know, I think it's I like the comment again because it makes us more conscious of what's going on.
Yes.
And yes, it hides most of the face. And, I mean, again, within the craziness of all this, I've had people say to me, and these are not people coming in therapy because the protests have started. I haven't been working. I don't work on Mondays in therapy, but friends say, well, yes, they're rioting, but at least they're wearing masks. It's like, whoa.
That is interesting. That is interesting.
That's like, whoa.
Actually, this is from Tiffany Hook Loomis. Excuse me if I'm mispronouncing that. This is sort of a denser version of the same thing. As many are aware of the pandemic of racism that has been most elevated this week and weekend in America, I am curious if you see this archetype of contagion also at play here. Watching the video of the murder of Floyd makes me think about the connection between contagion and disgust, that was interesting, and the terrible abuse of power that comes with this sense of morality one aligns with when there is a projection of contagion about a whole group of people who are, of course, most affected by this virus.
Yes, I mean, of course, racism was based on the idea of something bad in people who have dark skin or who look different from us, that there's something bad within them. And in fact, there was a racist trope about one drop of blood, having one drop of a certain kind of blood meant that you were then Black, and that then you had this thing that had to be protected against. The archetype of contagion or contamination or toxicity, they're interchangeable, contagion, contamination, toxicity, has been always associated with those human beings that we need to oppress and we need to control, because they bring bad things by their very being. In other words, they can't just change their behavior and we can find them acceptable. It's something about them that is within them that we have to cordon off or separate from ourselves. And so, yes, it's been a big part of racism. And it was a big part of witch hunts also. And the idea of the witch in the Middle Ages had to do with her breath and what she could suck out your soul if you came too close to her mouth, because she had these potentials of interacting with you. And it was more like sucking you in rather than blowing out on you. But I'm sure there must have been some blowing out also, because it was a lot about her breath. So, again, these themes, these emotional themes that are connected to disgust, get organized around contamination and contagion again and again and again. And it doesn't go anywhere good, ever, as far as I know. And the real concern I have right now is the fact that the mask itself doesn't have any science behind it, is more mandated and more of a signal now that, at least where I live, that the curve is flattened. In other words, now that there's less concern about the actual virus, the desire to wear the mask seems to have increased. And the way that we could enter into changing this, actually, I just wanted to mention that because I was reading a little bit of research on the issue of contamination and disgust and how you deal with it to get people to lower their threat level and their feelings. And it's by normalization, that is the willingness to accept inevitable risks in relating to each other, and then learning that there are benefits that outweigh the risks of relating. So, if we could normalize for people through information the idea that there's not much benefit in wearing the mask, and there are real benefits in relating to each other, then people might be able to shift somewhat out of this feeling that wearing the mask is protecting them. I think without normalizing it and without talking about risks and benefits, that the masks have already taken on a part of the collective mind, and we're moving rapidly in the direction of reading the mask as a virtue signal. Whether you're reading it from the side of wearing the mask is good or not wearing the mask is good. Either side is a problem, So I think that there is something to be done, and something that is somewhat the responsibility of those of us who are essential workers, to get the word out about the reality of masks and the danger of masks, and to help people recognize that wearing a mask is a big communication. It's not subtle. And then it takes on unconscious meaning, and projective identification enters into it quickly as people, decide that they're going to moralize and speak through a bullhorn at each other, telling each other, this is dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
You have to wear the mask and stop talking.
Mm-hmm.
So, that's very dangerous.
Okay.
That way of relating to ordinary people, So that's kind of my last thing, I think.
I know that you have to end early because you have another presentation. It's 3:52 and you want to end by 3:55. Thank you. Let me just tell you, and I think this can be discussed later, some people were uncomfortable with the assertion about African American men not wearing masks, as they were treating it as racist, which other people said, no, she's noting a phenomenon, not
That's right.
recommending it.
Right.
So
That's right.
I think you may have a bit of an argument in emails.
Okay, well, let me see if I can clarify that, because I'd like to avoid that particular conversation.
Of course.
First of all, it's hearsay. Somebody told me this was happening in Burlington, Vermont. It's not my recommendation. I don't make recommendations about mask wearing. I'm not a politician. I'm not any leader in that way. Number two, the person who told me said that his understanding was it was not mandated for African American men. And my understanding, again, this is just based on my understanding of the issue for African American men, that they had objected themselves to wearing masks because of the social signal. This is not my theory. This is not my idea. I'm not an African American man, and I only brought it up because I think that the complexity of mask wearing is an issue across many different populations. Yes, the meaning of it, Absolutely. I hope that's clear now.
Yes, I think so. Okay. We'll see what comes in emails, but it's clear to many people. So thank you very much. A wonderful talk. We do have a launch of the book Breakfast at Kusnak this Wednesday at this time, and then we'll see Andrew Samuels in a little more than 2 weeks. We'll return to our normal Wednesday. Thank you so much for speaking to us, and I want to let you go because I know you have other work to do. It is wonderful to see you.
It was lovely to be here and lovely to see friends. Thank you so much.
Fantastic.
Lovely.
I wish we had applause. Take care. Have a good evening.
Thank you.